Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would read this little video that I thought would be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video that I'm going to review by Mr. AKHi TV. And AKHi TV, of course, is a channel that I like to review quite often. And the reason why that is because I've always said this, but AKHi TV, even out of all the boxing content creators, even out of all the possible YouTube channels, or even the media overall that you might take a look at, whether they be Ring Magazine or ESPN or PBC or Fox Sports, whatever. The majority of media and also especially fans, they usually have some sort of agenda, and a big part of the reason why they usually have some sort of agenda is because they're more than likely trying to protect overall what they're really infatuated with which is certain favorite fighters or athletes that they may be a particular fan of. We've seen it with Shannon Sharp in the media with LeBron James. We've seen it with other people in the media as well within the tennis, sphere. I've seen a lot of the tennis media try to go against Novak Djokovic, or at least state that the reason why he eventually became better than Federer and Nadal is because Federer and Nadal were getting old, which is bullshit. But whatever. That's a conversation for another time. And of course, when you talk about the LDBC and the media, basically what their main goal is to make sure that basically any non-black fighter, any non-black American fighter that is going to be looked at as great for their generation or debatably an all-time great, that they're not remembered as an all-time great. Because once again, what their objective and what their goal is to make sure that the American all-time great boxing list, or the boxing list of all-time greats, is that it's about at least 90% black American fighters. And I would say that the majority of all-time great, not just American boxers, but boxers in general, that they mainly have been that of American black boxers. You have many great ones, of course, including Roy Jones, including that of, Muhammad Ali, of course. You have Sugar Ray Leonard, Floyd Mayweather Jr., marvelous Marvin Hagler, and a multitude of other guys, pronounced P. Whitaker. But that being stated, once again, that does not mean that there is not other all-time greats of other demographics. And while, guys like Bob Arum and Larry Merchant and maybe certain guys like that in HBO boxing when they were around, when they were trying to maybe degrade certain black boxers, especially Floyd Mayweather Jr., because they did not like how Floyd Mayweather Jr., how he pretty much took charge of his career. Pretty much the LDBC and the media, they do the same thing with, once again, other non-black fighters, so once again, they're really no better than that of ESPN or that of or that of some of these other media sites that try to degrade black fighters or try to pander to other certain races by putting fighters on there that maybe don't quite deserve it as of yet. But new media pretty much does the same thing. They're just in reverse. They just do it with a completely different demographic. But I mean, one thing I'll at least say is this though. Even with ESPN and some of those other guys, I mean, at least they still give certain black fighters credit. Like the LDBC and new media, they basically try to like wipe any all-time great non-black fighter basically off the face of the earth. Like if you were to just ask them the top 10 pound per pound list and the all-time great list, like there's like Roberto Duran or Chavez Sr. or Canelo Alvarez or Calzaghe or things like that, or Usyk, like those fighters, according to them, like they wouldn't even exist. So once again, these guys, you got to be very careful with them, because just like ESPN and a certain amount of other boxing media, they can be very, very biased. But of course, once again, and racially motivated. But, we're going to be talking about Oleksandr Usyk once again here. And a big part of the reason, once again, why I'm going to be talking about it is because Oleksandr Usyk, once again, in my view, he has clearly transformed himself into an all-time great level fighter. I don't think that, to be honest with you, that's really even a debate. Now, it depends on who you count to be an all-time great level boxer. In my personal view, if you're somewhere within the top 50 to top 100 boxers of all time, in my personal view, you could be looked at potentially as an all-time great, unless you were a person that literally lost every big fight in your career, maybe like that of a Mike Tyson. A certain amount of people, they always say that Mike Tyson is this all-time great fighter, but if you actually want to talk about who debatably might be the most overrated heavyweight of all time, debatably the most overrated fighter of all time, it might very well be Mike Tyson. And I think that Mike Tyson is a phenomenal talent, but basically, whenever you talk about Mike Tyson's career, all you're going to get is this shit about, oh, well, Mike Tyson, he wasn't motivated after the 80s, and, overall, he wasn't the same, blah, blah, blah. And, that could be true, but at the end of the day, listen, we don't call Penny Hardaway one of the top 10 greatest one of the top 10 greatest NBA players or an all-time great level NBA player, because we take a look at his career and say, oh, well, he was so talented, he was so great, and he could have potentially won a title before the injury. That's great, but at the end of the day, that shit didn't happen. So, certain people, they want to go off of certain results, when it fits their narrative, and they want to degrade a certain fighter and say it doesn't matter, they ended up losing that big fight. But then when it doesn't fit their narrative, then all of a sudden they'll make any excuses that they can. And AKHi TV is no different, once again, because he's a major fan. He's a major fanboy. And fanboys, once again, they always have to feel that, once again, that they have to protect that person overall that they're infatuated with, because basically they're in love with that thing. That's why, once again, if you criticize Terrence Crawford even in somewhat of a truthful or at least somewhat of a fair way, not even just completely degrading the man, but if you overall say something, AKHi TV is going to take it super personally. And that's why, once again, you cannot rely on these guys' analyzations, because they don't know the difference between proper and constructive criticism and someone who is really doing it more for racial reasons. That's why they cannot be, once again, trusted in terms of their analyzation, because they just don't have the proper mindset. They're always going to be emotional first, but it is what it is. So that means what? Anytime that there's any sort of constructive criticism, they're immediately going to take it as an attack and as somewhat racially motivated. Because they're not even going to take a look at the facts on the table unless it's something that, they might possibly agree with, so they don't have a logical state of mind. But once again, Oleksandr Usyk, who's an all-time great level fighter in my personal view, or has transformed himself into one. The question is where is he in terms amongst the all-time great heavyweights and in terms of some of the other all-time great level fighters? And of course, AKHi TV, he's going to be talking about the heavyweight division. And of course, the main thing that certain people have been asking now is that, is Oleksandr Usyk not only the greatest of his era, but can he be, maybe within the top 5 heavyweights of all time, can he be classified as a quote-unquote GOAT, or at least an all-time great level fighter? And this, of course, brings me to the question of, is Oleksandr Usyk greater, or is he a better fighter than what Muhammad Ali was? Because, of course, there's many comparisons between these two now, because Muhammad Ali, of course, at one point in time, I believe, was the undisputed champion of the heavyweight division when there was only one title there, I believe, and there was only one champion. And on top of that, they both have the same height, they both have the same reach, they both are extraordinarily talented and skilled fighters and all-time great level fighters. And of course, a certain amount of people have been talking about it. But AKHi TV, of course, he's going to be talking a little bit about the history of the heavyweight division, as well am I. But AKHi TV, what he's really going to show you here is that he's not really ever going to consider Oleksandr Usyk an all-time great, and he's not really ever going to give him the credit that he more than likely richly deserves. Because basically what AKHi TV says in this video is that even if Oleksandr Usyk ends up defeating a whole bunch of these younger lions, like they allegedly want him to do in order to be all-time great, that the furthest level that they're really ever going to put him on is Evander Holyfield. Someone that, ended up losing and getting stopped multiple times in his career. And don't get it twisted, Evander Holyfield, in my view, is an all-time great level fighter. But in my personal view, Usyk would even be a level above him, because he was actually able to beat the bigger and the best heavyweights of his day. And Evander Holyfield beat a lot of great heavyweights, but he was not the best heavyweight of his day. The best heavyweight of his day was Lennox Lewis. Oleksandr Usyk just beat the 3 best guys of the heavyweight division, and he pretty much did it without any controversy whatsoever. He did it overall quite clearly. But anyways, AKHi TV, once again, he's going to be talking about it. I thought that I would tune in. Let's get into it. Let's see what he has to say. And we're going to talk about some of the all-time great heavyweights that have blessed, of course, the heavyweight division.
Shocking news came out that Broccoli knocked out Usyk and Dubois in sparring. Check it out.
With Usyk, I don't think he'll say yes, because I mean, stopping as well in sparring. I don't know, he knows how good I am. I don't know if he'll say yes.
You're making this up.
Huh?
You're making this up.
I know we've heard you say that you stopped Daniel Dubois and Usyk in sparring. Can you elaborate on that?
They never come back to say that I'm lying, because they know it's the truth. And because, when you go to spar someone in the gym, so you're not allowed to record it, because if I was allowed, I was going to pause the video. And I'm happy because nobody can, say that I'm lying, so it's true.
Now, this dude right here, I believe that his name is Martin Bakole, some African fighter, I believe, who especially recently has been more on the map because, of course, he knocked out the very talented young prospect in Jared Big Baby Anderson of the American heavyweight. For those of you also, by the way, that don't know, Lawrence, or excuse me, not Lawrence. I'm thinking of Lawrence Okoli, I believe the British fighter that fights in the cruiserweight division. But Martin Bakole, this dude right here, once again, this African fighter who recently got the biggest win of his career, he does have one loss on his record. And keep in mind that that one loss on the record is a knockout loss to Michael Hunter, who, by the way, for those of you that don't know, Oleksandr Usyk had to run through the cruiserweight division. That was a very talented cruiserweight division that Oleksandr Usyk had to run through. You had the undefeated Glowacki, the Polish fighter that actually had decent boxing ability. Now, am I going to claim that he necessarily was an A+ level skilled boxer for a boxer that I've seen? No, not necessarily, but I'd say that he at least deserves to be on the A- to A level for a cruiserweight, especially. He ended up knocking out Marco Huck, who defended that title for several years. Now, Marco Huck, in my view, was a very stiff and rigid German fighter, pretty much what a lot of German fighters are like. That's why, Arthur Abraham fought very stiff as well, very tall and upright with very little head movement. But Marco Huck was still a relative threat. But once that division really started getting more talented within its era of the Maurice Bradyses, the Alexander Usyks, the Michael Hunters, and the Glowackis, that's when Marco Huck started losing a little bit more because Marco Huck was just not known for the swiftest amount of movement. Once again, a lot of German fighters, they're very stiff. They fight very tall and very upright. They don't really have the best amount of head movement. And that's why eventually he got stopped against Glowacki. And I remember that fight. That fight was on the PBC at one point in time, I believe. But Alexander Usyk beat both of those guys. He won his first title over Glowacki, I believe, the WBO Cruiserweight title. Then he knocked out Marco Huck, or excuse me, not knocked out, but he beat him. He also beat Michael Hunter, who would later on have a draw against Alexander Povetkin, and then knock out Martin Bakole, this dude right here. Although I'm sure Martin Bakole probably has improved as a fighter. But of course the logic that AKHi TV tries to use with fighters that he doesn't like, he loves to do this bullshit of there's no excuses, too green, when it comes to certain fighters. But then with other times he will use the excuse. But once again, he had to go through Michael Hunter, then later Tony Bellew, who's probably about a B grade level fighter, but he was coming off of the wins over David Haye, an older version of David Haye, but he beat him twice. And then, of course, he beat Maurice Bradyses, and he also beat Murat Gassiev, who knocked out the undefeated Junior Dorticos, who I believe, if he didn't have a 100% knockout ratio, he had very close. Junior Dorticos was running through a lot of contenders for that division, and Murat Gassiev had a very tough fight with him, and he eventually knocked him out. So I don't think a lot of people, once again, really realize how strong that cruiserweight division really was when Alexander Usyk beat those guys. Now, when Usyk ended up unifying the cruiserweight division, in my view, that was really enough to put him in the top 10 pound for pound, especially since he had never really been knocked down against any of those guys. And on top of that, he had unified the division. But then he goes up to the heavyweight division, and then he beats AJ Anthony Joshua, the first heavyweight that he beats. They're a guy that ran through literally everybody in that weight class. That's why, AKHi TV, he's going to make some correlations here, but they're not really going to make any sense. But we're going to take a look at that as it goes along. But this dude right here, Martin Bakole, I do expect more than likely that he's gotten better ever since the Michael Hunter loss. Would I favor Michael Hunter in a rematch against Bakole? I'm not really sure. I would have to see, maybe both of their work as of recent. But Michael Hunter hasn't been as active as what he used to be. But this dude right here, he is very dangerous. He's very powerful. As you can see, he's big, a little bit overweight, but he's a dude that knows how to box, and he's extraordinarily powerful. So we'll see where he goes.
I mean, the way Bakole destroyed Jared Anderson by knocking him out in a devastating fashion, this don't surprise.
And he doesn't really have bad boxing ability either. Now, when I take a look at him right here, it looks like he keeps his hands down a little bit too low at times. But, he's definitely got some talent. And, he's also got some great athleticism and mega power in his side as well, which is really going to help him. I would really love to see this dude fight the winner of the Dubois versus Joseph Parker winner, which is a fantastic fight, by the way. But whoever wins that fight is more than likely going to get the winner of Alexander Usyk, is more than likely going to get Alexander Usyk. So we'll see. But it'll be interesting.
Me at all.
But I don't know if I see a lot of people really giving him a big fight because this dude is a big threat in the heavyweight division right now. Like I said, he's got good boxing ability to a degree. He's very big. He's very powerful. And on top of that, why the hell would you really want to fight with this guy when, you possibly could get a fight against a Usyk or a Dubois or an AJ or a Ruiz or You know, I mean, honestly, you might really want to fight almost anyone else other than this guy in the heavyweight division, because this guy is not going to give you a major paycheck. He's not really that well known. I've known very few African fighters that have really ever gotten super popular in the sport of boxing. And then on top of that, he's super dangerous and he doesn't have a title. So why the hell, if you're one of these guys, would you really want to fight this dude?
Jared Anderson was supposed to be the future of the heavyweight division. He was an undefeated contender, and Broccoli walked right through him. This is the reason why, to be an all-time great, becoming undisputed is not enough. Yes, that's the first step, but no, becoming undisputed doesn't automatically make you an all-time great. I need you guys to understand and realize the history of the heavyweight division. The heavyweight division.
Well, if you're talking about being undisputed, if you're talking about the way that, say, like a Naoya Inoue did it at 118 pounds, then I would understand. Or if you're talking about, you know, for example, if Jaron Boots Ennis unified the 147-pound weight class right now, when there's really not a whole lot of talent there, I would get it. But when you're talking about Oleksandr Usyk, once again, unifying the cruiserweight division, which was the most talented that it had been literally in years, it was literally crawling with great contenders, whether they be from, you know, Africa, you know, the African-American fighter Michael Hunter, or strong European fighters from Poland, or, you know, maybe some other places, you know, even some top-level British contenders, and even some guys that, you know, probably were not as talented, but were long-reigning champions there for a while, like Marco Huck, certain guys like that. Oleksandr Usyk literally ran through that whole entire weight class. And then when you go up to the heavyweight division, he beats AJ, who literally has almost everybody on his list, you know, except the likes of Wilder, Fury. You know, he literally has everyone else on there. He has Joseph Parker and Andrew Ruiz, and, you know, he has, you know, I'm trying to think who else. He has Dillian White on there. He has Alexander Povetkin. Like, AJ has ran through so many contenders. And Usyk made Anthony Joshua really look like an amateur in both of those fights. So that's what Usyk was able to do. Then he gets in the ring against Fury, someone that was looked at as the best heavyweight of his generation before those fights, and Usyk clearly beats him on 2 separate occasions. You know, a guy that ended up embarrassing Klitschko, Dillian White, and Deontay Wilder.
Division have always had rich history. Back in the golden era, we had fighters like Joe Louis, Jack Johnson, Muhammad Ali, George Foreman, Joe Frazier, Larry Holmes, Mike Tyson, Holyfield, Lennox Lewis. Now, when it comes to
Mike Tyson, once again, in my personal view, because a lot, you know, I see certain people talk about Tyson Fury. Is he, quote unquote, the most overrated heavyweight boxer of all time? And, you know, everyone has their own different opinion. Like, if you were to ask my father, he believes personally that Larry Holmes is the most overrated fighter of all time, at least when you talk about the heavyweight division. In my personal view, Larry Holmes was not really a part of the strongest era, but I'm not gonna call him the most overrated, because I don't really ever hear anyone call Larry Holmes the greatest heavyweight of all time. In fact, I think that he's been a little bit underrated. Now, the most overrated heavyweight of all time by a mile, in my view, is Mike Tyson. And once again, I don't even think it's close, because when you take a look at his generation, like AKHi TV wants to act like when Usyk ended up unifying the weight class at heavyweight that it was quote-unquote dead. Bullshit, it wasn't dead. He beat Anthony Joshua, he beat Fury, he beat Danny Dubois, and there is still so much rich talent that is there. When Mike Tyson was around during the heavyweight division and he was unified, there wasn't shit there. There wasn't a pot to piss in terms of talent. Like, the best champions that he ever defeated were, like, the best champion that he defeated during that time was, like, fucking Frank Bruno. And we all know how Frank Bruno ended up turning out. You know, so, I mean, give me a fucking break. You know, Mike Tyson beat guys like James Tillis and James Bone Crusher Smith and Tony Tubbs. Tony Scrub is really what his name should have been. But when it came down to it overall, you know, he beat a whole bunch of scrubs, a whole bunch of bums. You know, and I like Tyson. Tyson was the fighter that got me into boxing. But every time that he got in the ring with an A-grade level talent, not only did he lose, but he lost big. He got stopped. And, of course, if you ask Mike Tyson fans and a certain amount of people, they'll say, oh, well, Mike was never really the same after the 80s. Right, well, we don't judge other certain athletes off of that. If we're going to keep using this excuse, and we have to use that excuse with every single boxer, like with Lomachenko, oh, well, Lomachenko, we don't know how great his career really would have been, because he got in boxing, in professional boxing, at his late 20s, you know, because he had so many amateur fights and blah, blah, blah. And, I mean, I'm sure that that is a little bit of a valid excuse, but at the end of the day, we still overall cannot rank certain things on an all-time great level if they don't have the results. But what certain people love to do, especially fanatics and fans, they love to rank things off of things that may not have results. But then when you try to rank something off of, the same thing, or if someone else tries to rank that thing off of no results, they get offended, because that's not a fighter that they want to put within the same thing as, the fighter that they worship. But anyway,
Lennox Lewis,
so basically what I'm stating is that we need to keep the same standards.
Larry Holmes, Muhammad Ali, Joe Louis. These fighters in particular have records that have yet to be broken.
It's really very unfortunate that these guys don't mention Rocky Marciano, but we all know why they're not mentioning Rocky Marciano, because these guys are very racially motivated and very bitter. So they're not going to mention a guy like Rocky Marciano. This is just my personal view of things. I don't know, a lot of people are not going to like it. It is what it is. Rocky Marciano, in my personal view, he's right there with Ali. He's right there with Lennox Lewis in terms of the greatest heavyweights of all time. And in my view, yes, he is above Joe Louis. Now, in terms of peak v peak, is he quite the skilled fighter or textbook is what a Joe Louis was? Not necessarily, but he was a guy that actually beat at least 3 or 4 of the elite black fighters of his day. When you take a look at Joe Louis, he fought only really 2 black fighters in his career, and he lost to one of them, got completely outperformed by Ezra Charles, and then Jersey Joe Walcott, of course, I believe he beat once or twice. But it's so funny that AKHi TV, this is the same guy, overall that states that, oh, well, Usyk, he beat a lot of these weaker European champions, and European champions aren't usually as dominant as American black fighters. Right, well then, if we're going to go by those standards, because boxing overall, at least today, that you're usually getting the best of the best in whatever weight division you're at. Now, is there certain divisions that are weaker than others? Yes. But don't sit here and tell me that Fury and AJ Anthony Joshua were just these weak-ass, bum-ass European fighters. Like, come on, man. Just stop. They were not some weak-ass European fighters. Fury at one point in time had top 10 level pound-for-pound acclaim. And to be quite honest with you, AJ Anthony Joshua at one point in time could have been potential for top 10 pound-for-pound level acclaim as well. When it comes down to it. But Joe Louis, when you take a look at his record, it's so funny that these guys will mention Joe Louis, overall. But once again, they want to try and say that, well, Usyk fought a lot of these European guys. Dude, Joe Louis is like about 99% of his title fights and his fights in general were against Caucasian champions back in the day, when it was finally starting to intermix with some of the more elite black level challengers. Because, for example, like back in Jack Dempsey's day, he did not really take on any quote unquote Negro challengers, is what he would state. He refused to fight him, or he did not fight him, because that's just how they kind of did certain things back then. But is what it is. But Joe Louis, once again, is he going to be remembered then as not an all-time great heavyweight because the majority of the guys that he fought were American Caucasians? How many great American Caucasian fighters have there been, really, ever since Rocky Marciano? Pretty much none, in all honesty. So once again, does that mean that Joe Louis is going to get penalized? But once again, in my view, Rocky Marciano, he's above Joe Louis, and I know a lot of people ain't gonna like that. I've had some people in my comment section say, well, he beat some older fighters. Well, he beat Ezra Charles when he was about 34 years old, so that's not really that old. He knocked him out, I believe, once or twice. He did beat Jersey Joe Walcott, I think, when he was older at about 38 years old, but keep in mind, he was coming off of knockout wins over Ezra Charles, who I believe had given Rocky Marciano hell. And then, of course, he beat Archie Moore when Archie Moore was still looked at as the best light heavyweight in the world. And Rocky Marciano was able to knock him out. Now, of course, he was 41, I believe, at the time, or 39, somewhere around there, so he still would have been older. Yes, some of those guys were a bit older. But to say, once again, and this is why the age excuse is very dangerous, because all those guys were still at a great point in their career. So you have to be very careful with the quote-unquote age excuse. Now, if you're talking about Joe Louis when Rocky Marciano beat him, yeah, Joe Louis was definitely not at a great point in his career anymore. So that one, of course, was a bit different. Even though Joe Louis had a massive size advantage over Rocky, by the way, which never gets talked about. But, Joe Louis, of course, clearly was a little bit over the hill. But the other fighters, they were still at a very great point in their career.
For example, Muhammad Ali. When he first became a champion, he didn't just become a champion. He became an undisputed champion. Back in the day, there was only one belt. To get to that belt, you have to fight.
Right, and that's why it also has to be ranked as a little bit different. because when you talk about the undisputed era of today, like they'll try to take a look and they'll be like, oh, well, Muhammad Ali became undisputed, at the age of 22, and that's great, but there was only one title. So that the point is that, we don't really know, had there been 4 different titles like there would have been today, had he really overall, became completely undisputed. Because what if Joe Frazier a little bit later on would have had one of the titles? Are we completely sure that Muhammad Ali would have became undisputed? And that's not me once again trying to claim that his undisputed title necessarily means completely less, but it does have to be looked at as different. It's kind of like Bill Russell and his titles back in the day. His titles still count in my view, but they almost kind of count for half credit, at least for each of them, because, when you talk about it, there was only 8 official teams and there was nowhere near the amount of free agency back then. So it's just completely different.
One killer after another. For example, in the lightweight division.
But that also being stated, what that also means more than likely is that some of the elite contenders that Ali fought that did not become champion during that time because there was only one belt, that means that we're also going to have to take a look at them differently, because they may have became a champion had there been 4 different titles.
We have Gervonta, Shakur, Lomachenko, Keyshawn Davis, Andy Cruz. Just imagine, in order to become a champion, you have to go through all of these guys and beat them in order to become the champion. That's what the likes of Muhammad Ali, Larry Holmes, and Joe Louis had to do.
No, it's not. Joe Louis, once again, 99% of the fighters that he fought throughout his career were stiff American Caucasian fighters. And don't get it twisted, some of those guys still were relatively good to great, but I mean, it's just so funny. Once again, this is the same dude that claimed, well, Usyk, he's fighting these European champions. Joe Louis was during a time to where there was not really a whole lot of elite black fighters in the heavyweight era. So if you're really going to talk about that era, overall, once again, why does Joe Louis really get so much credit? You're saying that he's fighting killer after killer. This is the same dude, once again, in AKHi TV, that claimed that Usyk is fighting European champions, and that's a quote-unquote dead heavyweight division, right? But Joe Louis is just fighting killer after killer. Like, come on.
That's what they had to deal with.
And Larry Holmes, no offense against him, great fighter. He did get some great names like Ray Mercer, and I'm sure that there's a couple of other names that I'm forgetting at the moment. But a lot of the guys that he fought, in my view, they were not really elite level fighters. You look at Larry Holmes' era, that just was not a super elite era. When you talk about the heavyweight era in terms of the weaker era for the Joe Louis and Rocky Marcial era postward, there was probably about 3 eras that were probably at weak points. The Larry Holmes era, the beginning Mike Tyson era, and then the Vladimir Klitschko era. Those are the 3 weakest eras probably in the heavyweight eras.
Basically, Usyk's journey in the heavyweight division so far to become undisputed is equivalent to Muhammad Ali at 22 years old, becoming the champion, becoming the undisputed champion, defeating and dethroning the Mike Tyson of his time, Sonny Liston. That's how Sonny Liston was perceived. Muhammad Ali was the heavy underdog, even though Muhammad Ali was a gold medalist.
Yes, he absolutely was. And also keep in mind that Oleksandr Usyk was the underdog against both AJ and Fury. And he also was a gold medalist. And he was way undersized against those guys. That's also part of the reason what makes Oleksandr Usyk so great. Because Ali was 6'3" and about 220, 230 pounds. But also keep in mind that he would have been probably relatively lengthier and taller and sometimes bigger than some of those guys. Not in every fight, of course, Sonny Liston, of course, was a big bear. He was probably girthier than Ali, so he was probably relative in size. George Foreman, of course, was bigger. Joe Frazier, even though he was clearly shorter, probably could have been comparable in size. Ken Norton as well. So, I mean, that's not me trying to say that Ali overall, is just fighting guys that are way smaller. But keep in mind, a part of what makes Oleksandr Usyk so great and what he achieved is that those guys, especially AJ and what's his name, Tyson Fury, they were a decent amount bigger than him. Like they outweighed him by like 20 plus pounds.
Therefore,
and even Danny Dubois is bigger than Usyk as well, and Usyk pretty much toyed with him.
All of Usyk's accomplishments in the heavyweight division so far at 37 years old, it took him years to get here. Well, Muhammad Ali did equivalence of that in a more dominant fashion by 22 years old.
No, he didn't. And what I'm going to state is this, because AKHi TV is trying to make this equivalency that Oleksandr Usyk, that him becoming undisputed right now, and Ali becoming undisputed at 22 years old in a completely different era, that it's just completely the same. No, It's not. And a big part of the reason why that is because, first of all, you're completely ignoring Oleksandr Usyk's accomplishments at cruiserweights. Like, these guys are all of a sudden just trying to pretend that Oleksandr Usyk started off at heavyweight and that, he just started his career like 2 years ago, and that he only has 5 fights on his resume. The man ran through an extraordinarily talented cruiserweight division, extremely talented, and he beat them all, made some of them really look destitute. And when you take a look at Ali's record before he really fought, what was his name, Sonny Liston, he really didn't fight shit before he fought Sonny Liston, at least knowing that probably would have been looked at as an all-time great level fighter or a super great fighter. When you take a look at Oleksandr Usyk's record, he has several A-grade names on his record, at least you could debate it. And beating AJ Anthony Joshua and Fury, no, those guys were looked at as two of the best of their era. So, if you don't want to compare it necessarily to Muhammad Ali era terms, because there was only one belt during that era, that's fine. But if we're going to compare it to Lennox Lewis, that would have been like Lennox Lewis for 4 fights in a row, fighting Evander Holyfield, and then either Riddick Bowe or Mike Tyson in 4 fights and winning every single one of them clearly. That's what it would have been comparable to. Not to Muhammad Ali just having one great big fight at 22, winning the title over Sonny Liston. Didn't really fight anyone before then. Go take a look at his record for those of you that don't believe me. Didn't fight anyone really before then, and then beat Liston and then becomes the undisputed champion of the world when there's only one belt there. No, what that really is more comparable to is more of someone like who's a UFC fighter who didn't really fight that great of contenders and then all of a sudden gets the belt over a very dominant champion. Like when Islam Makhachev, for example, like when he ended up getting the title over Charles Oliveira, or Charles, he wasn't the champion any longer because I believe he missed weight. But Islam, he didn't really fight anyone that elite prior to Charles Oliveira. He fought some good contenders, but not great ones. But then he gets in the ring against Charles and just completely whoops his ass and completely dominates him. That's what it's comparable to. Not to Oleksandr Usyk beating two of the greatest heavyweights of his era. No, it's not really that comparable.
While Muhammad Ali was still green, he was not even in his prime yet. He was just entering his prime.
Right, he's not in his prime yet, but he beat the shit out of Sonny Liston, who was the main champion. Now, this is interesting once again because, as I said in the beginning of the video, they love to use the quote-unquote green excuse when it suits them. Like when Devin Haney and Lomachenko, when they talked about it happening, they said, well, even if Lomachenko does beat Devin Haney, he might be a bit green, and Lomachenko still won't fight him. And keep in mind that when people say that Canelo was a bit too green against Floyd Mayweather Jr., they say that it was an excuse, but then they use it with other fighters. Isn't that very particularly interesting? They use it with their favorite fighters. Once again, you can't trust these guys for an analysis because they're just your regular fanboy that's extremely bitter and racially motivated. So once again, you're not gonna get a logical analysis from any of these guys. But so once again, and when you talk about the Canelo Floyd situation, I'm not gonna say that Canelo was way too green, but what I will say is that I wouldn't say that he was absolutely at the peak of his career. Now, Ali was beginning the peak of his career. I'm not gonna say that he was too green against Liston, but he definitely wasn't experienced. So I think that that's somewhat of a fair thing to say. But in terms of Oleksandr Usyk, give the man credit, he did not really have any experience against, super great heavyweight level fighters before he got in the ring against AJ Anthony Joshua. And then he completely outboxed him. And, I thought, oh, well, AJ, he might just be a little bit more stiff. He might just have more of a suitable style for that of an Oleksandr Usyk. But then he beat Tyson Fury as well, and also Danny Dubois, who would eventually, go on a tear as he is right now. So I mean, Usyk definitely has accomplished great things. But I understand what AKHi TV is trying to state. But, I'm not going to say that Ali was a little bit too green. I would say that maybe slightly. He was definitely inexperienced. But once he won this fight, that's when his peak began.
Ali had already done it. Remember, old media made the narrative, even if you're 23 years old, you are still green. You have no experience. Well, I guess Muhammad...
Right, so why are you making the same excuse? Because you say that excuse with other fighters like Canelo Alvarez is allegedly bullshit, and sometimes it can be. Now, there's certain fighters that are a bit too green. Like, for example, when Lomachenko fought Orlando Salido in his second professional fight. Yeah, that for example, was way too early. But, once again, it's just so funny how AKHi TV, he uses that excuse whenever, overall, whenever it suits him.
Ali at 22 years old, while he's still green, with no experience, already accomplished what Usyk accomplished today at 30.
They got Oleksandr Usyk dressed up as Agent 47, the Hitman.
7. Now, what made Muhammad Ali the greatest of all time is obviously as the undisputed champion, he defended his undisputed title 18 times. He beat all of the veterans. He beat the champions. He beat the young lions. He beat one killer after another without ducking anyone. Do you guys?
Listen, Muhammad Ali was an all-time great fighter, and he did fight a lot of good to great fighters during his day. But this thing of Ali just fighting one killer after another in every single fight, all that is bullshit. Ali was an all-time great level fighter, but you're also going to find a certain amount of guys on there that just were not really that good. Like Ron Lyle, like he kind of gets talked about, but to be honest with you, he really was not that great of a fighter. Like his final record was like 33-14 or some shit. You also had, certain Caucasian British fighters on there that, they were okay, but they weren't really that great, like Joe Bugner and some of the other ones. Like Ali had his fair share of guys that weren't really supreme level fighters. So don't get it twisted. Did Ali have Cleveland Williams on there? Did he also have Joe Frazier, Sonny Liston, George Foreman, and Ken Norton and Floyd Patterson and other guys like that? Absolutely, no doubt about it. Don't get it twisted. Ali is an all-time great fighter with an all-time great resume. But this shit about him just fighting all these killers in an absolute row, no, all that is bullshit. But the reason why that gets propagated a lot is because a lot of people they worship Muhammad Ali like he's a god. A lot like Michael Jordan, a lot like Wayne Gretzky or Babe Ruth or Tom Brady. Certain athletes that are looked at as untouchable for certain sports. Whenever you say something that goes against the grain or goes against the regular narrative, people are going to take a look at you like you're crazy because they're so used to the story and the narrative that they've been hearing now for decades overall that when you say something a little bit different, you're going completely off code. Now, once again, don't get it twisted. Am I saying that Ali just fought a whole bunch of bums? No, absolutely not. That was Joe Louis, but it is what it is. I'm not gonna say that he fought a whole bunch of bums, but I definitely would not say that his competition was as great as what some people would say that it was. But anyway, but when you talk about Muhammad Ali, he did fight a certain amount of very good to great fighters, but was every fight just against a complete killer? No.
You guys know how impressive that is. Well, that's not even all. Muhammad Ali did all of that while getting his prime years taken away from him. When Muhammad Ali, at the peak of his prime, when he entered the peak of his prime, they found a way to dethrone Muhammad Ali. Not in the ring, but
And that definitely is not the worst point. What I will state is this, is that Muhammad Ali, of course, he was in prison, I believe, for about those 3 or 4 years, however long he was in there for, or jail, wherever he was. And, all the hats off to the man. He stood for what he believed in. But then after that, he still had a lot of prime years left. Now, what I will say is this. I'm not really quite sure if Muhammad Ali was ever as quick or ever as athletic ever again as what he was formerly before the jail years. But he still was a great fighter. He still was very fast. He still was a great fighter. But if we're also going to be honest about Muhammad Ali and certain things, once he started losing a little bit of that athleticism, you started seeing some of the holes that were actually in his game. Meaning what? That, and there are certain athletes that are just like that, like Roy Jones Jr. A lot of people talk about that right now, to where once the athleticism wanes, you get to see some of the more holes in their system. And Roy Jones Jr. and Muhammad Ali, they're actually very similar in terms of that way, to where when you take a look at them, they eventually either got knocked out or they eventually got floored, by a certain punch, or, would get hit a lot more than what you would remember if you watch some of their fights. Because Muhammad Ali, as much credit as he really gets for being a great defensive fighter, he's really, in all honesty with you, he has a little bit of an overrated defensive ability. And that's not me saying that he is not a decent defensive fighter, but for example, take a look at his first fight against Ken Norton. And for a championship level fighter, like Ali literally was getting peppered with jabs the whole entire time in that fight. He was literally like Ken Norton was beating the shit out of Ali in that first fight with jabs. And that's why he won that first fight. Now, or part of it. Now you can definitely tell that Ali, in my view, probably underestimated him a bit. And on top of that, that it was just a tough style. And on top of that, he was a bit slower. There was no doubt about it. But Ali, once again, in terms of his skill set, what I'm actually going to tell you is this. Oleksandr Usyk as an all-around fighter. Now it's kind of hard to compare eras because you never know what Ali or certain fighters from back then would have been in this era. Now that we know certain things and knew certain fighters and styles have arrived, then you just personally don't know what he would have been like for this era. But since so many people like to cross compare skill sets from different eras, if we're really going to go there, Oleksandr Usyk is probably a more skilled fighter than what Muhammad Ali ever was. And I know that a lot of people are not going to like that. Offensively, Ali was as great as almost any heavyweight in history. But when you talk about in terms of the defensive ability, even though he did not have bad defense, he didn't really have great defense. And that's why you take a look at the Joe Frazier fight. He got hit with one of the hooks or one of the punches that Ali would always get hit with would be a left hook. And that's why he got his jaw broken against Ken Norton, because Ken Norton lands some whopping ass left hooks in that fight, also rights over the top, also peppered him with the jab the whole fight. And keep in mind that that was when Ali was 31 years old and before he had even rematched Joe Frazier or fought George Foreman. So before someone says overall, oh, Ali was way too old for that fight, bullshit. No, he wasn't. Ali ended up losing that fight because Ken Norton was just a very bad style for him. Now, give Ali credit. He won the other two matches, to be fair. I've heard many people state that they thought that Ken Norton really should have won those fights. To be honest, I've never watched them, so I can't tell you. But Ken Norton definitely won the first one. And, is what it is. But Ali, of course, was an all-time great fighter. But Usyk, in terms of head movement and in terms of consistent head movement, getting out of the range, and also defensive ability, yes, he's better than Ali in those areas. It just is what it is. So this narrative of Ali and Holmes and all these guys that they would have just destroyed Usyk and that he would have stood no chance, no, that's not true. Once again, take a look at Ali versus Ken Norton. Let me tell you what, if certain guys like Ken Norton, overall can give Ali a hell of a time 3 times in a row, Oleksandr Usyk would be able to do it too. Because there's no way overall that you're going to sit here and tell me that a guy like Ken Norton is more skilled or better or greater than Oleksandr Usyk. Now once again, is this me saying that Usyk is greater than Ali? No, not necessarily, because once again, I think that the resume is just too vast for Ali, at least to call Usyk within that same class as a Lewis or a Marciano or an Ali quite as of yet. But if he does roll through, some of the other contenders, then he could potentially be on that level. Usyk, in my view, is at least debatably a top 10 heavyweight of all time after his most recent performances. I mean, he just, he was able to beat every single guy there. He became undisputed, and he beat the 2 guys that were looked at as the best heavyweights of his era, and they had a significant size advantage.
Side of the ring. So basically, we never seen the best of Muhammad Ali. When Muhammad Ali had to go to jail, or he was facing jail, do you guys know at that time Ali was undefeated? He was untouchable. He was moving like a lightweight and punching like a heavyweight. He was unstoppable.
And listen, I don't completely disagree with what AKHi TV is saying there, that Muhammad Ali definitely lost some prime years, and he had definitely lost a half a step or at least a step after the jail years. I don't completely mind that. But what's so very interesting is that when it comes to other fighters that he needs to tear down, that are especially non-Black American fighters, he's not going to make that same excuse. Like, do you know, it's very easy to make that excuse with any fighter. Like, if we take a look at Lomachenko, we can say, well, Lomachenko really was a natural 130-pounder because, to be honest with you, that's probably the God's honest truth. And he really only started losing once he went up to 135 and he fought Teofimo and Devin Haney, when those guys were really bigger than him. AKHi TV could make up that narrative for Lomachenko, but he's not going to, because he don't give a shit about Lomachenko, and he needs to make sure that Lomachenko is tear down in the most way possible. Now, would I completely come up with that narrative for Lomachenko? No, not really, because he was still in his 30s when he lost to Teofimo Lopez and what was his name, Devin Haney. And on top of that, if you're supposed to be regarded as the best fighter on the planet, I don't think that there was enough of a size advantage for either of those guys to where if Lomachenko is going to be the clear number 1 pound for pound best fighter in the world, to where you lose those fights, especially against Teofimo Lopez. So, but I'm not one for really giving excuses unless I think they're very valid. But, I understand that Ali lost a little bit of a step, but he also did lose certain fights in his career. This myth and this narrative that Ali was just this completely perfect fighter and that, overall that he was this defensive master, to be quite honest with you, no, that's been a little bit more of a myth. Now, don't get it twisted. Once again, all-time great level fighter and a guy overall that, once again, is debatably the greatest heavyweight of all time and in my top 10 greatest fighters of all time. no matter the weight class. But once again, when we talk about Ali as this quote-unquote flawless fighter that didn't have any faults, no, that was not true.
Hello, I'm Patrick Stewart. I believe in...
Looking to end the year strong? Join Planet Fitness now for $1 down and get top-tier equipment and free...
Was unstoppable. Well, we never got to see Muhammad Ali at the peak of his prime, and he is still the GOAT, which makes it even more impressive. Then after Muhammad Ali fought against the Vietnam War and returned back in the ring, he was no longer the same like he was before that.
And let's also keep in mind that when we talk about Oleksandr Usyk, once again, not me trying to state that he's on the same level as Ali, because I think that he doesn't have quite enough to really be there, at least as of yet. But also keep in mind that if we're going to make that excuse with Ali, we can also make the excuse with Usyk that he really didn't join professional boxing until he was probably in his late 20s. Usyk is 37 years old right now, man. He's going to turn 38 next month. So imagine possibly what Usyk could have achieved, possibly had he been in professional boxing ever since he was about, 23 to 25 years old. We may never know that.
You could tell he lost a step. Even then, he still managed to beat GOAT-level fighters the likes of Frazier and George Foreman. Then
Joe Frazier is not a GOAT-level fighter. This is what these guys like to do, once again, to prop up certain fighters as all-time level greats. And then with other fighters, they won't do it because they need to try to tear them down. Joe Frazier was a great fighter. He lost to Muhammad Ali on 2 separate occasions out of the trilogy. And, of course, he got canned against George Foreman. Now, of course, I can't blame Joe Frazier too much for that because, Muhammad Ali, in my view, is, debatably the greatest and most talented heavyweight of all time, at least when you talk about it in terms of athleticism. And, of course, George Foreman, athleticism, shit, he's up there with anybody as well because the amount of power and size that dude had, especially for his era, just phenomenal. But George Foreman, when you talk about him, George Foreman was not a supremely skilled fighter. George Foreman was a dude that pretty much won off a complete brute strength and he, the little bit of skill, of course, that he did have. But once again, that's why I say what George Foreman really was is that he was almost kind of like the Deontay Wilder of his day, just a greater version. Because he actually won certain big fights, and of course he was able to defend his title a certain amount of the times. But George Foreman was really the biggest heavyweight of his day, at least one of them. Kind of like how Wilder was very big, Wilder, of course was about 6'7" with an 80-something inch arm reach and about 220, 230 pounds. Not the heaviest guy, but very tall and lanky, and on top of that, has great, excellent power, so that does need to be talked about. But anyways, like I said, George Foreman was huge. But if you take a look at a certain amount of his fights, especially against highly technical fighters, a lot of the times he usually didn't beat those guys because George Foreman really only had one style of fighting. And he'll even tell you that. If you take a look at George Foreman in certain interviews, he'll say that I really only had about 1 or 2 punches to beat you with. And if you got past that, I was possibly going to be in trouble. George Foreman will tell you that.
at the end of his career, he only started losing because he...
But once again, is that me trying to disclaim credit for George Foreman? No. But the reason why I do that is because in every single era, you always have these guys that are saying, oh, those guys would have not lasted in this era. Those guys were just so much better, so much skilled, so much more skilled. George Foreman was very similar to Deontay Wilder. Now, he was greater and probably more skilled than what Deontay Wilder was, in my view, debatably. But George Foreman was not this all-time great level skilled fighter for a heavyweight. He was a big brawler, man. That dude was a big bruiser.
wanted to raise money to do good.
Take a look at his fight versus Muhammad Ali. That dude is just swinging punches all over the place. And that's the part of the reason why Ali was able to knock him out eventually, because George Foreman, that dude was a wild swinging bear. Like that dude, like what that fight would have been comparable to. It's almost kind of like, like I'm trying to, it would almost be like, I'm trying to think of how to compare it. It would almost be like a giant bear of a dog, trying to attack a super venomous snake, or something like that. That's almost the best way that I can compare it to, where basically, the snakes, might be smaller, but at the end of the day, the snake is very savvy. It's very smart. And at the end of the day, it can catch you with its fangs. George Foreman was obviously slower than Muhammad Ali, and he still hurt Muhammad Ali a little bit. But, overall, once again, was he this all-time great skilled fighter? No.
Ali was donating most of his money to hospitals for cancer patients that can't afford it, etc., etc. Due to these reasons, due to Muhammad Ali being invited to meet presidents all around the world, receiving a king welcome, he had to keep fighting. And he kept fighting even though he had the disease called Parkinson. He was fighting while showing early signs of Parkinson's disease, which is why he started losing. And his Parkinson...
Well, is that really why he started losing AKHi TV, or is that the excuse that you're really going to make? Because once again, a lot of the narratives that these guys love to use is that, oh, well, these guys already have losses. Well, they can't make that excuse with Oleksandr Usyk, because overall, once again, Usyk is undefeated. So they realize that, they've kind of trapped themselves a little bit with that narrative. And don't get it twisted. Listen, if you retired undefeated, or if you ended up undefeated in your career and you fought elite level caliber fighters for your weight classes, like Rocky Marciano, like Andreas or G. Ward, like that, of other fighters, even Joe Calzaghe, and of course, if Crawford or Usyk retire undefeated, then of course, yes, of course, they deserve a great, adieu. They deserve great credit for that, no doubt about it. But Muhammad Ali didn't just lose overall because he was starting to get older, and I'm not even sure when he started to really begin showing Parkinson's. I'd really have to look it up and explore it for myself, because pretty much almost anything this dude says, AKHi TV, you really got to check it, because this dude will tell you that the sky is orange when it's really blue. So, I mean, as long as it fits his narrative. But, when it comes down to the overall, but once again, no, that's not the only reason why Muhammad Ali lost. Muhammad Ali also lost because he was not someone that was as defensively responsible probably as what he needed to be. He relied a lot on his athleticism. When he threw his jab, he was very front foot heavy. He had a problem overall with great jabbers also as well. And he also had a problem with guys that had an excellent left hook that could get on the inside. So as great as what Muhammad Ali was, no, he was not absolutely perfect in his fighting style either. So that's why I say when these guys say that, oh, Usyk, well, how can we put him as the all-time great when guys like Larry Holmes and some of these other guys would outbox him easily? How do you know that, dude? Larry Holmes ended up eventually losing to a light heavyweight in Michael Spinks. Now, he was a bit older by that time, to be fair. Muhammad Ali ended up getting outboxed by Ken Norton and also beaten and outboxed by Joe Frazier. And in my personal view, I mean, is anyone really going to try to debate that Ken Norton and Joe Frazier? I mean, some people might debate that Joe Frazier is greater than Oleksandr Usyk. Would I ever say that? Absolutely not. Joe Frazier, in my view, is a great fighter, but I would not say that he's over the likes of Oleksandr Usyk with just what he's accomplished. Wouldn't say it. But it's up to you. But once again, to state the likes of, someone like a Usyk just wouldn't stand a chance. Absolute nonsense. Oleksandr Usyk is a great fighter, and he had a chance over any great fighter of the past as well. Not saying that he'd beat every single one or that he's for sure the GOAT or anything like that, but to state overall that he just doesn't have a chance, all that is a bunch of bullshit rhetoric to try and diminish the dude's accomplishments so he's not remembered as an all-time great fighter. So once again, they can keep their racial agenda.
Increased because he kept doing that. He should have had retired a long time ago before he did. Anyways, Muhammad Ali became the first 3 times undisputed champion.
And that is great, but keep in mind also, as AKHi TV said, that was an era to where there pretty much was only one title. So that does have to be looked at as a little bit different compared to the Undisputed of later on, where if you wanted to become Undisputed, you had to win 4 titles.
And he defended his title 18 times against killers, one after another. He even challenged the Cubans.
Well, he fought a lot of good fighters. He fought some great fighters as well. But there was also a certain amount of fighters that he fought, once again, that were not extraordinarily talented. Certain British dudes like Joe Bugner and some other guys like that, or Ron Lyle, that in my view were not supremely talented, or other guys like that. Now, he did fight some very good contenders that never would become champion. For example, like Ernie Shavers. But I'm not really quite sure if I would say that Ernie Shavers was a super great fighter. I would say that at best, had he been in the 4-belt era, he probably could have became a champion. But do I think that he would have been a champion for a super long time? No. And this is also what I'm going to say, because people also say this shit about how, Usyk, like, oh, the fighters back then were just way better, all this other stuff, And listen, there are certain weaker eras. But, people, like I had this one person stating that I think that, what the hell was his name? First dude, I think, to knock out Tommy Morrison, or one of the first, Ray Mercer, that was his name, Ray Mercer. Ray Mercer overall was a dude that won a title one time in his career, defended it once, and then ended up losing it. And you got people talking about this guy like he's this major first ballot Hall of Famer. Like, fighters like this appear in the heavyweight division all the time. you know, and Andrew Ruiz, he was a champion at one point in time, beat AJ Anthony Joshua. Then in the next fight, he loses it. You know, Daniel Dubois just recently got a belt. Alexander Povetkin, I believe, was somewhat of a champion there at one point in time. People are acting like this heavyweight era is just so different. And no, it's really not that vastly different. Now, if you want to debate that in your view, that in certain eras that there was more talent, you could debate that. But, you know, for example, once again, when you want to talk about actual weak eras, you're talking about guys like, you know, in the mid to the late 80s in the Mike Tyson era, the Larry Holmes era, there really was not a supreme level of talent in my view. And also the Vladimir Klitschko era. Really none of those eras, in my view, were the strongest. The strongest eras of the heavyweight division were at the beginning of the 60s, in my view. I mean, of course, the 50s as well, because of Rocky Marciano. So, I mean, there was definitely some, at least a little bit of strong competition. Of course, they wouldn't be as skilled as what they probably would be today. But for the era, of course, it was very good. You know, then, of course, later on, once again, the Ali, Foreman, and Joe Frazier era. Then later on, of course, the Tyson, Evander Holyfield, Lennox Lewis era. Then, of course, later on, the Fury, Wilder, AJ, Usyk, and Klitschko era. You know, that era also was very decently talented.
Sensation.
Now, the era, once Vladimir Klitschko really started to reign, that's when the heavyweight division really started to be more dead. That was an example of a dead heavyweight division. Not today's heavyweight division, where you got all this talent, whether you want to say that those guys were as skilled or not. Once again, this is the era of super heavyweights. So they're not really going to look as graceful at certain times or as skilled. But could some of these guys hold their own in other generations? Yes, they could. Joseph Parker and Andrew Ruiz and, you know, possibly Luis Ortiz and AJ Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury and Wilder, you know, and Usyk and some of these guys, they could have held their own in other, you know, divisions or in other eras. Now, is that me saying that they would have absolutely became the best of that era undisputedly? No, but they would have held their own.
One of the greatest Cubans of
Because of certain guys like Ray Mercer and John Ruiz and, you know, all these other guys, if certain guys like that can become champions, you know, the certain guys like that I just mentioned can possibly become champions too.
all time, the heavyweight, to come to the U.S. to turn pro in order to fight him because he had ran out of competition. He cleaned out the division to the point where there was no more smoke.
Key benefits about using Indeed is easy to use and everything is in one place.
When the Wi-Fi is working all through your house and the family's online.
To the point where there was no more smoke. Well, guess what? Lennox Lewis also did the same. Joe Louis also did the same. Do you guys know Joe Louis defended his undisputed title?
Joe Louis didn't do the same at all. Once again, this is the same dude that claimed that Oleksandr Usyk, that, you know, overall that he fought European champions, and they make this debate when they need to about, oh, well, European champions have on average been weaker than the American champions, you know, or you know, these European or Caucasian champions. That's all they say whenever it comes to fighters that they need to tear down. So you tell me that Joe Louis just fought killer after killer after killer in a generation that there was very few black contenders or, you know, black championship level caliber fighters, and then when he finally did get in with one of the two better black American fighters of his era, he got completely outperformed by Ezra Charles.
25 times? That's the record, by the way. No one in the history of the sport.
Well, of course, look at some of the fucking guys that he fought. I mean, no offense, but, you know, had Rocky Marciano or, you know, maybe overall, you know, Ezra Charles or Jersey Joe Walcott been a little bit earlier, then it would have been a little bit more understandable. But no offense, dude, but it's like, come on, man, look at a lot of his title defenses. Like, some of those guys were not the most talented. I'm sorry. It is what it is. You know, now, did he still defeat some guys that were very decent? Like, I think he defeated Max Baer. Yeah, I mean, he defeated some decent Caucasian American heavyweights, but that was also an era overall to where it was not really as talented as what it would be a little bit later on.
Probably in any sport, even the UFC, has defended their undisputed title 25 times. Even
right, but once again, take a look at who he defended it against. No offense against Joe Louis. But once again, this is the same dude that debated overall that Usyk is a part of weak European, you know, divisions. That's what he stated. You want to take a look at a quote-unquote weak Caucasian or weak European era, take a look at Joe Louis's era, bro. Like, take a look at that era. At least Rocky Marciano beat some actual decent and actually like great Caucasian level champions, and on top of that, great black level champions as well.
Today.
And don't get it twisted. I mean, Joe Louis defeated some great ones as well. You know, he defeated some great Caucasian and great black champions as well, but a lot of them also I would not claim as elite.
There's no one that came close to defending any title 25 times, let alone undisputed. Well, let me make sure you guys heard me right. Joe Louis was so special, he defended his undisputed title 25 times. Muhammad Ali was so special, he defended his heavyweight title, his undisputed title, 18 times, even though he got his prime years taken away from him. Can you imagine Muhammad Ali in his prime? What a big...
Well, Muhammad Ali had the absolute peak of him taken away. But in terms of his prime years, he still had a lot of prime years left. Obviously, because he was still able to defeat Joe Frazier and some of those other guys. What was taken away from Ali was his absolute peak. But his prime, no. He would still have a prime. Because he would still be in his early 30s. I believe by the time that he had returned, or in his late 20s. And, of course, that's when he ended up getting defeated at Joe Frazier. You know, and that's when we started to see a little bit more holes in Ali's game.
He would have...
Because, you know, they were always somewhat there. It's just that Ali could get away with it a little bit because he was so much quicker, usually, than everybody else. And on top of that, he was an elite level athlete.
Had been.
But once again, don't get it twisted. All-time great fighter, and a fighter that was a great fighter.
Muhammad Ali was 100 years ahead of his time. Even though he got his prime years taken away from him, he still became the greatest of all time. That's how special he is. Larry Holmes is also one of the GOATs. So is Lennox Lewis. Lennox Lewis became a 2 times undisputed champion, defeating everyone he fought, or anyone that defeated.
Absolutely, Lennox Lewis, probably the most underrated heavyweight of all time. When you talk about the most overrated heavyweight of all time, it's Mike Tyson. I don't even think that it's a close second. And when you talk about probably the 2 most underrated fighters of all time, it's probably Rocky Marciano, or at least heavyweights. It's probably Rocky Marciano and Lennox Lewis. Because people barely talk about Rocky Marciano, really, to be quite honest with you, because he's a Caucasian, if we're going to be real with you. And then Lennox Lewis, he's very underrated because he's British, and a lot of people really don't pay attention to him quite as much, you know, unfortunately. But yes, he's right there with anybody in terms of the heavyweight discussion. But Lennox Lewis, even he ended up losing a couple of times. You know, he got knocked out by 2 people that, in all honesty, he probably never should have got knocked out against. He got knocked out against an American in Hassan Rahman, I believe, a fighter that, in my view, that was never really super elite, but, you know, would eventually become a champion, a 2-time champion, I believe, in the heavyweight division. So he was at least a decent contender and champion for a little bit. You know, and he also lost to Oliver McCall, someone that really should have never won a belt in the first place, but Lennox Lewis, he got caught by him and knocked down the first fight. You know, so once again, this narrative of these guys just being completely untouchable to Oleksandr Usyk, all that is a bunch of fanboyish shit. Once again, Lewis ended up getting knocked out twice in his career, knocked out cold clocked. You know, so once again, you know, this bullshit about Usyk or some of these other heavyweights not standing a chance. No, they would stand a chance, especially an all-time great level fighter like an Oleksandr Usyk. Now, is that me stating that he would 100% beat those guys? No. Not necessarily, but to state that he just doesn't have a chance. Well, if Oliver McCall and Hassan Rahman, you know, if they have a chance, you know, if, you know, certain guys during Muhammad Ali's time, like Joe Frazier and Ken Norton have a chance, you know, then guess what? You know, Oleksandr Usyk would at least have a chance. So come on, man.
He came back and beat them again by knocking them out. Well, Lennox Lewis didn't just become an undisputed champion 2 times. He didn't just do that. He also defended his undisputed titles against killers, one after another. One come to mind is Klitschko. After Lennox Lewis beat Klitschko, Klitschko went on to reign as the heavyweight king for an entire decade. Klitschko ended up beating everyone in his path and retiring without a blemish outside of Lennox Lewis. He was more skilled than...
What the fuck is this man talking about? The man is talking about Vladimir Klitschko when he talks about reigning for a whole decade. Vitaly Klitschko never reigned for a whole decade, dude. Like, he never reigned for a whole decade. Now, he was a very decent fighter, but what is this dude talking about, man? Vladimir Klitschko was the one that would go on to reign for a decade. You know, after Vladimir Klitschko would lose some of the early, you know, like, I think he would lose 2 fights early on in his career, and then I think he would at least avenge one of them, and then come back. But what the fuck is this dude talking about? Vitaly Klitschko never reigned over an era for an entire decade. He never fought that long.
Tyson
At least after the Lennox Lewis fight.
Fury, he was better than Tyson Fury. That's the top of fighters Lennox Lewis defended his undisputed.
I'm not really quite sure if Vitaly Klitschko or Vladimir Klitschko is better than Tyson Fury. And I know that a lot of people are going to disagree, but those guys were also, they fought very tall. They fought a little bit stiff. And to be quite honest with you, I think that, had they fought certain fighters like a Fury, someone that would have been lengthy and someone that had good maneuverability and movement, I'm not really quite sure how they would have handled it, because we all see what happened with Vladimir Klitschko against Tyson Fury all the way back in about 2015. Now, of course, a certain amount of people are going to say, oh, well, Vladimir Klitschko, he was old at that time, blah, blah, blah. Well, he was about 37, 38 years old. But Klitschko was still the unified heavyweight champion of the world. So just to say this bullshit about how washed up he was, if he was washed up, then he would have not gave Anthony Joshua that great fight that he did 2 years later. And that was when Klitschko was like 40. So keep in mind, no, he was not washed up. To say maybe that he was older, sure, you can state that. Maybe even state that he wasn't at his absolute peak, sure, those are fair to say. But washed up, no. Washed up is what Terence Crawford fought when Kell Brook and Amir Khan were in the welterweight division. That's washed up.
The title against, we're not talking about the Klitschko brother that fought Tyson Fury. Well, that's what Usyk has to do.
Right, so what the fuck are you talking about then, dude? Because Vitaly Klitschko never reigned for a decade, man.
To enter the round with these heavyweight greats from the golden era, especially when he's in the heavyweight division during the dead era.
But this isn't the dead era. Once again, AKHi TV is trying to make this bullshit excuse. No, the dead era was the Vladimir Klitschko era. At least that's the most recent dead era. That was the dead era. Because there was no fighters that were really other than some of these Eastern European fighters. And it's not like they were even super duper talented Eastern European fighters. Like a lot of them were Kubrat Pulev or some of these other guys or some heavyweights that were either, fat with man titties like Mike Perez from Cuba and some of these other guys, or guys like Brian Jennings, all these other guys, that was an African American fighter. That was not a super talented heavyweight division. But by the time that Fury ended Klitschko's reign, it was starting to show through a lot of talent. So no, this era was not dead, not by far. By far, excuse me. Once again, because you had guys like Wilder, you had guys like AJ, Joseph Parker, Andrew Ruiz, Dana Dubois. You also had that of Tyson Fury. You had Dillian White, Luis Ortiz, all those guys within this era. Joe Joyce.
Have the competition that those fighters had during the golden era, meaning Usyk has more to prove. Yes,
well, he has more to prove in terms of probably being on the level of a Muhammad Ali. But in terms of being an all-time great fighter, no, he doesn't have really any more to prove in terms of being an all-time great fighter. But AKHi TV, not only is he super racially motivated, so it's very hard for him to admit that Usyk could be an all-time great. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, Terence Bud Crawford has only defeated about 5 A-grade level fighters, and he's already top 5, top 10 of all time, according to AKHi TV and these guys. Not even a debate, according to them. When has Terence Crawford ever went to a weight division and fought against all the young lions and defended his titles a whole bunch of times? All of a sudden now he's creating this narrative of, well, Undisputed is only the first step. Bullshit. Because when it came to Terence Bud Crawford, when the fuck has he ever stayed at a weight division and defended against the quote-unquote young lions? Did he stay at 140? Overall and said, I'm going to fight possibly some of these upcoming guys or something like that. Now, to be fair, Crawford felt he accomplished everything there that he needed to. And at the time, he probably did. But it's not like he was around during the Josh Taylor, Jose Ramirez, Regis Prograis era. He wasn't around during that time. Terence Crawford already moved up to 147. And he really didn't even fight that many great welterweights, in all honesty with you. He really only fought about 2 good welterweights. And Sean Porter and Errol Spence Jr. Jeff Horn, of course, was a champion, but he was a guy that pretty much beat Manny Pacquiao that, in my view, heavily underestimated him. He would have not beat Danny Garcia. He would have not beat Sean Porter. He would have not beat any of those guys, and pretty much everyone knew that, which is why they were so surprised that Jeff Horn gave Manny Pacquiao that tough of a fight, But Terence Crawford could have stayed at 147 and said, you know what, I'm going to try to face Duran Butsenes. But where's the energy saying that, oh, well, Crawford, in order to be on the all-time great level, or in order for him to be top 5, top 10, I need to see him defeat more young lions. Like, you're never going to hear him say that shit.
impressive to become undisputed like Usyk did. That's the first step you have to do in order to become a great. But you can't stop there. Just like the past great fighters I named, from Lennox Lewis, Muhammad Ali, Larry Holmes, to Joe Louis. Those guys defended their undisputed titles against young lions on the come-up. After defeating the veterans, after defeating the champions, after becoming undisputed, they ended up defending their undisputed title from 18 to 25 times against killers, young lions.
Not every single one was a killer. And on top of that, it's basically almost impossible to defend an undisputed status today 18 or 20 times because of the sanctioning fees. And on top of that, there's just not one belt today. You know, so I mean, it just is what it is. And on top of that, you could just do certain shit back then that you can't do today. Like, you could fight 3 fighters in a row that would literally almost have a negative record. Now, that's not me stating that Ali necessarily did that. I think he fought better contenders than that. But to state overall, once again, that, you know, overall that he just fought a killer every single fight, that's not true. Now, he fought a lot of good contenders, and he also fought some great fighters, of course. We all know Ali's resume. But to say that he just fought a killer every fight, no, he didn't. And once again, this guy's trying to act like Oleksandr Usyk, like he just has work within the heavyweight division. Dude, Oleksandr Usyk has work within 2 weight classes. Now, if you want to state that Usyk is not the greater heavyweight nor the greater fighter than Ali, that's completely understandable. I would technically agree. But once again, when you talk about all-time great status, yes, Usyk is up there with a lot of great fighters. And he's up there with a lot of all-time great level fighters as well.
Of Bacoli, Moses Thomas, Dubois, who truthfully already knocked out Usyk.
Therapy has always been such a scary idea to me because
Or Parker, who Dubois is fighting next.
And they keep coming up with this narrative of Usyk once again was knocked out against Dubois. No, he wasn't. First of all, the shot was low. At least in my personal view, it was debatably low. But even if you didn't think that it was low, Oleksandr Usyk heard the shot being called low. And the referee say timeout. You know, so once again, so automatically Oleksandr Usyk already knows that he has time. So you have these idiots or these guys that have a racial motivation or wanted Danny Dubois to win, like some of these British dudes, you know, overall that wanted Danny Dubois to win. And they're like, oh, Dubois got robbed. There really should have been a knockout. Well, how do we know that Oleksandr Usyk started to begin hearing a count that he would have not possibly got back up from that punch? Oleksandr Usyk went down and he heard the thing time out. So even if you think that shot was a legal blow, at the end of the day, Usyk knew overall that it was called as an illegal blow. So he knew that he had time. So how do we know that Usyk may not possibly get back up from that shot? We don't.
That fight can go either way. Until Usyk defend his titles against these young killers, that's when you can join him along with the all-time greats. That's when he can become one of the all-time greats. Perhaps...
Once again, Mr. AKHi TV, I hate to break it to you, but in the heavyweight division, he's already defeated 3 A-grade level fighters because they were all champions. But on top of that, he also ended up defeating a lot of the younger lions at the cruiserweight division. He defeated Michael Hunter. He defeated Glowacki. He defeated Marco Huck, who was a champion there for a while. He defeated that. You know, since we're counting, you know, every quote-unquote killer, allegedly, you know, that Ali and some of these other guys face, you know, I might as well include Marco Huck because he was a champion for a while, you know, because it's not like Ali didn't face some of these stiff-ass European fighters as well, you know, since we're talking about quote-unquote every killer. But Usyk overall, he fought Glowacki. You know, he also fought Murat Gassiev. Both those guys are champions. He fought Maris Bradis. You know, but yeah, anyway. But yeah, he fought overall some of those guys. He fought a lot of good fighters.
The bottom of the list, since the heavyweight
and Michael Hunter, who knocked out Bacoli, by the way.
Division have a rich history. If Usyk defeat all of these guys, these young lions on the come up in the heavyweight division and retires, then you can put his name next to Holyfield or something like that.
And you hear what AKHi TV said? He said if he defeats all these big names, then maybe you could put him at the bottom of the list, like next to Holyfield or something like that. You know, so basically what is AKHi TV saying? No matter what Oleksandr Usyk does, I'm not going to put him as debatably the greatest of all time because I don't want to. I have a racial motivation, and on top of that, no matter what he does, he's never going to be there. Evander never beat every one of his day. Usyk so far has. So it has to be different. And Tyson Fury was an exceptionally skilled boxer for his size. AJ was relatively skilled as well. You know, of course, you know, they had faults. But once again, Lewis was not perfect. One can make the debate that if Rahman and that overall, that if Oliver McCall can knock out Lewis, that Evander Holyfield could have potentially done it, but he was not able to. So it is what it is. Now, of course, Lewis obviously was probably more prepared and better for those fights and took them more seriously, of course. But once again, if one can make the argument that Lewis lost to those guys, then Evander should be able to do it too. Tyson Fury was undefeated, and Usyk was the only man, still is the only man, to ever defeat him, and was, you know, outweighed by a huge amount for both fights, and outlengthened and outreached by a great amount too, against a fighter that actually is an exceptional boxer for his size.
Huge compliment. That's a huge achievement. Last but not,
and I hate to tell AKHi TV this, but Oleksandr Usyk is already on the level of Evander Holyfield, man. Holyfield is a great fighter, but Usyk, in my view, to be honest with you, he's probably even a level above Holyfield in terms of certain things that he can do, in terms of skills, in terms of getting hit less, and also in terms of being undisputed in 2 separate weight classes. But some may debate that because, of course, Holyfield, he does have a great resume. He beat Tyson. He beat Riddick Bowe once in his career. He also did beat, I'm sure, of some cruiserweights that I'm not thinking of at the moment, like Muhammad Kwai, I believe, or whatever his name was. I'm not really quite sure how good he actually was, but maybe for some of you that were around during that era, you can tell me. And, of course, he also beat Michael Moore, who was a 2-time champion, I believe. He beat John Ruiz, who would later on become a champion. Now, John Ruiz, in my view, was never really an elite level fighter, but he was decent. You know, and I'm sure there might be 1 or 2 other wins that I'm not thinking of, you know. But anyway.
at least when it comes to sparring, just because someone did well.
But once again, also keep in mind that Evander Holyfield, that he lost a trilogy against Riddick Bowe, got stopped once in that fight. And also that you know, once again, he never beat Lennox Lewis. Really lost to him twice. Although the first one was a majority draw, it never should have been a draw. It was an awful decision. But yeah, but keep in mind that Usyk, against the guys that he was not favored against, he beat them on 2 separate occasions, 2 times, in both AJ, Anthony Joshua, and Fury.
In sparring or knock someone out doesn't necessarily mean they could beat him in the pro ranks. Remember, Jared Anderson actually beat Tyson Fury up in sparring, according to Bob Arum. But can Jared Anderson beat Tyson Fury up in the pros in a real fight? We don't know that.
I agree. Just like we also don't know if these older fighters would have absolutely dominated Oleksandr Usyk. We don't know that either. So once again, when we come to debates, when we come to arguments, we cannot go off of hypotheticals, man.
We can't say that for sure, which is my point.
At least not completely.
Exactly. And that's why we got to see these fights. Usyk against the likes of Hunter, against the likes of Broccoli, against...
He's already fought Michael Hunter, you idiot. Unless this man's talking about a different Hunter. But if he's talking about Michael Hunter, he already fought that dude, man. Like, what are you talking about?
The likes of Moses, etc., etc., etc. That being said, go ahead.
And Usyk may not last that much longer. Keep in mind that he's 37 years old. But I wonder if Usyk ends up losing within one of his next few fights, if AKHi is going to give the excuse about how quote-unquote old he is. Because we all know what would happen if it was Crawford or one of his favorite black fighters.
Go ahead and drop your thoughts in the comment section below. Subscribe below. And to be continued on.
But that pretty much is about it for today. I just thought that I would talk about that. I thought it was a very interesting video, also to give time to talk about the heavyweight division. Now, if you were to ask me my top 10 heavyweights of all time and who I would rank, I would probably have within the first tier guys like that of Muhammad Ali, Lennox Lewis, and Rocky Marciano. That would be my first tier. The next tier, I would probably have guys like George Foreman and Joe Louis and you know, I'm trying to think. You know, you might be able to have maybe Usyk somewhere within that realm if you wanted to. Evander Holyfield, I'd also have him within that realm as well. You know, debatably. So I'd have all those guys within the same realm. But of course, if you wanted to debate those guys as greater heavyweights than Usyk, of course I would get it, because it's not like Usyk has that many title defenses. I understand. But he was confirmed as the best of his era, and he beat already 3 champions in such a short amount of time. It's really phenomenal. And then after that, you know, if I were to come up with heavyweight champions, you know, so you're talking about anywhere from 8 to 10. I'm not really quite sure exactly who I would have there. I mean, Mike Tyson, of course, he had a certain amount of title defenses, but just my personal view, it's really a debate if Mike Tyson really even deserves to be in the top 10 of all time. Of course, you would also have certain guys like Vladimir Klitschko. Vitaly Klitschko would probably be in the top 20 somewhere. Larry Holmes, of course, I forgot about him. You know, Joe Frazier. And there might be a few others. I'm not really sure. I'd have to take a look, you know. But I'm sure overall that I'd find someone. But anyways, that pretty much is about it, you know, for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you all later. And we'll see where this goes.